Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
If you are someone who struggles with really coming down to determine which personality type you actually are in the Myers-Briggs system, you are not alone. A lot of people struggle with this. People, quite frankly, that have studied typology, that are in the midst of really understanding the Myers-Briggs system, who might even be, dare I say, training to be profilers in the Myers-Briggs system to help other people come to a best fit type. Even people in that realm struggle sometimes knowing who they are and how their mind is wired. It is not uncommon that when you're in this experience of understanding type and yourself, there are lookalikes. There are types that show up like other types, and sometimes it's hard to know a behavior you even show in the world. It's hard to know what the origination point of that behavior is. It's hard to know the motivation or the why behind what you do. So you're not alone, and don't panic. We're here to give some thoughts and some suggestions to you today on this show to help you if you're caught in a lookalike type situation in your life to make some determinations or at least start down the path of how to decide maybe which type you actually are.
Lookalikes mess us up in two different contexts. The first one is when we're trying to figure out somebody else's personality type, and the other is when we're trying to figure out our personality type. And one almost makes it worse for the other. You see lookalike types becoming a real challenge in communities where people talk a lot about celebrity types or characters in fiction, and they try to figure out the personality types of all these characters or people that are common, like almost like public property, but nobody actually knows, like they're not being professionally typed or profiled or given an assessment. And in these conversations, people get real emotionally attached to their guesses. And so
what?
Yeah.
How could that be?
Right. And so what happens is in a conversation about, like, say, is Donald Trump an ESTP or an ENTJ? You'll get people making very compelling arguments on both sides, or maybe not even compelling, maybe just really impassioned.
You had to pick Donald Trump, right, as an example, the most polarizing figure of our time.
Yeah, well, it's because that one I see a lot. I see that argument all the time. And so who better to profile than a type from a distance and notice the lookalike types of ESTP and ENTJ as a great example than somebody who's so polarizing in the modern world, because people are fighting about him anyway. They might as well fight about his Myers-Briggs type. So I'll see these arguments online and observe the passion behind the arguments and the certainty. And I can imagine that if I was trying to determine my best fit type and I was going between two of these, which as an ENTP, there's ENTPs who sometimes wonder if they're ESTPs or ENTJs. If I was looking at these arguments, the challenge of it being lookalikes means that I might be really confused about my own type, because I might be persuaded by maybe both arguments, maybe see both of these things inside of me. And so lookalike types make it challenging for people to have conversations, and they really double down on which side of the aisle they feel that a person is if they're one of these lookalikes. And then it makes it much more difficult for those who are doing research to find their best fit type. So I thought we could today go through some of the common lookalikes and just talk a little bit about maybe why they are, and some of the, like Joel mentioned, some of the strategies for at least getting to the heart of the matter. Now, just like with all previous podcasts that we've done on helping people find their best fit type, unfortunately, the answer to whether or not anything is going to definitively guide you there will be just as unsatisfying in this podcast as it has been in all the previous podcasts, which is there's no blood test to take. There's no definitive. There's no person or God on high that deems you your Myers-Briggs type and it's done. It is a self-discovery process. It doesn't matter if you're taking the official MBTI assessment or you've just taken 15 online tests and read 20 books on cognitive functions and you're still confused. Unfortunately, It is a self-discovery and system discovery process simultaneously. You're trying to learn a system that is relatively complex with a lot of things that kind of sound like each other. Like it really takes a key discernment to try to fillet out, not the dichotomies as much because those are intended to be very polarized, but the cognitive functions and what they all mean. And people who are well into the system, as you were saying earlier, Joel, people who are well into the system can sometimes get confused about which function is being represented in which situation. So on one hand, a person who's trying to figure out their best fit type is trying to learn the ins and outs of a relatively complicated system. And then on the other side, they're trying to match it up with what they know about themselves, which sometimes we are still discovering ourselves. We're still trying to figure out how we operate. Maybe we haven't been thrown into enough context to really be able to know, or maybe we have trained behaviors that aren't honest to us. Arguably, the system of ourselves is infinitely more complex than the system of, say, Myers-Briggs. And so you're trying to figure out two very complex systems simultaneously and then match them up to find your best fit type. And as we've said multiple times in the past in previous podcasts, sometimes you just have to thrash. And fortunately, there is benefit in the thrashing. The benefit is that you get to learn more about yourself because you're putting these pieces of information in front of you and trying them on for size and trying to figure out if they fit, or does this feel like a shirt off the rack, or does it feel like it was tailored for me? And that's one of the best introspective exercises that some people get their entire lives. So unfortunately, there's an unsatisfying statement at the end of all of it, which is sometimes you just have to thrash. And sometimes information that helps create that distinguishing between some of these factors, sometimes that can help. Because just like I mentioned, even seasoned typologists or people who are massively into personality types can sometimes get confused around elements of the system.
We talk about this in our profiler training class. Every year, a new group of students comes in. Well, every 6 months, a new group of students comes in. And often one of the first tier of people new students tend to sit down and profile with are family and friends. And it's tough for a lot of new students because they know their family and friends so well. All they see are the exceptions to the rule as they're going through some of the basics of profiling and helping that person discover their best fit type. They can see all the exceptions. They know so much about that person. Well, which person in your life do you see all of the exceptions even more so than your family and friends? It's yourself. You can see all of the things that maybe go against what type you've landed on. You're like, well, but yeah, and also I do this, and all these exceptions come up. So I think that's part of why there can be a challenge here, and you can see some lookalike types and really have some confusion around it. Because you are seeing yourself in all of the nuance, all of the fidelity, the full picture of you're inside your own experience, and you know all the things that break the rules or the quote unquote right answers for each type. And so this could be an explanation of why you might be having some challenge here.
So the first pattern that we're going to talk about is when it's difficult to tell if a specific cognitive function is in the dominant or the tertiary position. And this creates lookalikes like ISFPs and INFJs, or ISTPs and INTJs. A very common one that doesn't get talked about in type communities as much, but I see popping up more and more, are ESTJs and ENTPs, and ENTJs and ESTPs, and pretty much every combination, ESFPs and ENFJs. So these are people who have the cognitive function of either sensing or intuition for the most part in the tertiary position, and it's being very much identified with or over-relied upon.
If you're following along with our car model, tertiary is interchangeable with the 10-year-old. Dominant is interchangeable with the driver.
Right. And so in the case of, say, ISFPs and INFJs, introverted intuition or perspectives is the dominant or driver function for INFJs, and it's the 10-year-old or tertiary position for ISFPs. And one thing that makes it sometimes really tough to be able to determine this is that ISFPs also lead with introverted feeling or authenticity, which is a function that sees all of the aspects of an individual within. And so ISFPs are usually very well aware of their introverted intuition, that 10-year-old or tertiary function. They're usually very aware of when they're using it. There's a lot of identification with that function. And so it's very common for these two types to look like each other because of that reliance upon or that relationship with introverted intuition or perspectives. There's also a quirkiness to both of those types. There's a sensitivity to both of those types and a desire to express in some ways. This is a similar pattern that happens with ISTPs and INTJs. And the person usually knows that they're an introvert and a feeler in the first case, or an introvert and a thinker in the second case. But it's really difficult to know what that relationship with introverted intuition is, particularly people in the type community. Now, this wouldn't be an issue if you were talking to people who, ISPs, ISFPs, and ISTPs, who weren't interested in personality typology, because they'd be off doing things that are more prototypically ISP. They'd be off more in their bodies or with a relationship to engaging in the outside world. But if you're an ISP in the type community, or somebody who's really interested in typology, that means that you're somebody who really enjoys playing in the space of that 10-year-old or tertiary function. So you're going to have an even closer relationship to it. So it's almost like ISPs are preset to mistake themselves for INJs because of just by virtue of their interest in typology in and of itself. So these two types become lookalikes in the sense that there's a lot of ISPs who misidentify themselves as INJs, and then they start to become represented as INJs. And so in communities, people will say, oh, I know an INFJ or an INTJ, but in their mind, they're actually referring to an ISP. And so this becomes, in a lot of people's minds, part of the archetype. And so then these two types even more so become lookalikes because it becomes embedded in the community itself. And what's not interesting, what is very obvious, and we've talked about it before many times, is that traditionally, and I do think it's getting better because the community, the type community or different communities are more aware of this, but there is a very definitive intuitive bias in all of this. People who are into type and talk about it a lot, there's a sense that being an intuitive is expected. And if not expected, it might even be better, right, to be an intuitive. And so it's really easy for somebody who comes in, sees a lot about themselves in their inner world, really identifies with that intuitive 10-year-old or tertiary function, is already sort of wired to be fascinated by all of this, and so really identified with it even more, and then enters a community of people who talk about how intuition is so great and that it's better to be an intuitive. I don't know how every ISP doesn't think they're an INJ or maybe an INFP or an INTP, because there is this sense that it's the superior way to be, or at least traditionally has been. So these two types end up being lookalikes, and then you see a lot of, antagonism around it. They call fake INFJs like these fake unicorns, and INFJs become kind of protective about their type, and it turns into like sort of bad blood. But it makes sense. It makes sense why there would be a lookalike nature to that, or sort of that would be a phenomenon. But what's important to remember is that regardless of whether or not you have a relationship with introverted intuition, how it shows up in a dominant or driver position versus a 10-year-old or tertiary position is leagues different. They're very, very different. And I would argue that one of the best ways to know whether or not somebody is an ISP versus an INJ is not only how quote unquote strong it is or how obvious it is, but more how much energy can they apply to it? Like if a person can endlessly use introverted intuition, and that's in conversation or in reading or in topics or in world building internally or in future pacing or all the different ways that introverted intuition is used, can they do that for eternity? Or is there a moment when they just need to go do something else? And can they do they find intuitive conversation interesting, but have a hard time being a part of it? Maybe they find it fascinating sort of like by listening to it, but then eventually they realize that this is not really their wheelhouse, or maybe it's really interesting sort of topically, but not generically. And so how much space can a person hold there is actually a better determiner than maybe even looking at some of the other dichotomies.
I'm reminded by a conversation we've been having with Dr. Dario Nardi. He's been working with us on this Magic Diamond workshop with some small groups of students. And we were talking just, I think yesterday, the day before, with him about that dominant driver process, how much it is someone's identity, how much it is someone's experience. It's like a fish in water. The function is almost like the water around you as a fish. And I think that speaks to what you're saying. It's how much does this show up in your life? How much of this is a part of your entire experience, not just an aspect of your experience? For example, an INJ is going to be swimming in introverted intuition. This is going to be defining how they see the world in a lot of ways. And you might look at an ISP and think, well, man, it's really hard to tell. Like if you're an ISP, for example, you might really feel like you're in that space as well. And like Antonia said, it probably doesn't define every aspect of your entire existence. There is a moment when you're like, oh, I can kind of see myself being here or not being here. You have a looser relationship with it in some way. And so I think that's just a quick and dirty access point to see, is this something that's your entire experience, or is it something you can like let go of and grab when you need it?
I think a good litmus test for this particular lookalike or series of lookalikes is to see how the individual operates around very heavy intuitive conversation. I've noticed that people who have intuition as a 10-year-old or tertiary function, actually, I'm not going to talk about that broadly. I'm going to talk about this specifically with people who use introverted intuition as a 10-year-old or tertiary function. ISPs. I've noticed that they might be really fascinated by the conversation and observe it, but when sort of coaxed into it themselves, they have a very difficult time articulating their thoughts. And one of the reasons is that introverted intuition is a function that needs post-processing. It needs time to think what it feels all the way through. And if you're using introverted intuition as a dominant or driver, it's more likely that the intuitive concepts that are being brought up in the conversation, usually by ENPs, by the way, or INPs, people using extroverted intuition and with a bunch of what ifs. But it's more likely that somebody who's leading with introverted intuition, an INJ, has at least thought about some of these concepts in an ancillary way. They have considered something similar to it so that they can contribute without too much difficulty. So it's not that somebody who's an INJ doesn't need to post-process. It's just that they're more likely to have already done post-processing on the topic at a previous time so that they can bring their insights to the current conversation.
On the topic or on the mechanism? In other words, they've done a different topic, but the same type of way of thinking, the system of thinking about it has been practiced somewhere else on a different topic they can apply to this one.
Right. So the connections are real obvious. And so it's an easier time of contributing and articulating the thoughts that they have already processed through. Whereas I think an ISP, it's less likely they've spent or clocked as many hours doing that same processing. And so oftentimes, unless it's a very specific subject of that is around intuition that they are into, like take, for example, Myers-Briggs, an ISP can very much contribute to conversations around Myers-Briggs because they've already done a ton of post-processing. But if the intuitive conversation goes outside the realm of something that they've already decided they're into, they're far less likely to be able to contribute. And sometimes that's frustrating. Sometimes intuitive conversation can be really frustrating to an ISP because they know they can't contribute in the moment, or they may not be able to contribute in the moment because they haven't post-processed this already previously. And that means they're going to have to receive the information and post-process it later. And if it's not an area they're already interested in, that might not be work they want to do. And so it just gets boring. It's just not interesting to them. So I would say that when it comes to ISPs, when you're looking at whether or not the person, like if you are trying to determine if you're an INJ or ISP, It's not so much how long can you hold an intuitive conversation around a topic that you find already interesting enough to have done a deep dive. It's when intuitive conversation starts bouncing around. And when you're with another intuitive, other intuitives are delighted that it's bouncing around because they're getting an opportunity to actually be in an intuitive place in real time with other intuitives, having the kind of conversation that they're used to having just inside. And so it's generative. It gives them energy. They're like delighted that this is happening. Whereas somebody who has intuition as a tertiary and inferior, and in this case, an ISP using introverted intuition as a tertiary, might actually find themselves annoyed or bored or just reaching a limit where it's still interesting. And then they might make a recommendation to go do something together, something that's not just sitting around talking. And so it's not so much that an ISP isn't using introverted intuition often or even well. It's just more categorical. It's more specific to certain topics. Whereas if you're using it as a dominant function, it's more likely to take in more territory and cross-pollinate a little bit more.
I want to pause this really quick and just make a quick mention that if you have a lookalike type, we're not going to cover every possible combination of lookalike types in this podcast. We're going to talk about some principles and some common ones to give you the pattern so you may be able to discover some things in your own life. But the whole point of this is to give you some things to think about, not solve the problem for you, because it's a journey of self-discovery, quite frankly, in your life. You're going to have to take the driver's seat in this and make this work for you. So I just want to make that comment really quick that at the end, if we didn't cover something, you're like, wait, you didn't mention my type, you don't feel super disappointed because we probably won't get to all of them.
So another one that follows the same tertiary principle, and there are a lot of them. So if you're between two types and they're lookalike types, and you notice that one of them has the same dominant driver as tertiary 10-year-old, then you're probably dealing with this principle. Another one that's common that I'm seeing more these days are ESTJ and ENTP. And that one is interesting because you wouldn't think that those two would be lookalikes at all. And yet I'm seeing more and more ESTJs profile themselves or type themselves as ENTPs. And I suspect this is, again, a similar situation as somebody who is attracted to this topic. They're already going to have a stronger relationship with their intuitive side. Also, I'm seeing this more and more in personal development. In personal growth and personal development, like ESTJs that go in, a lot of times really identify with that extroverted intuition because that's a big piece of how they're getting through personal growth. Now, of course, interestingly enough, our recommendation to ESTJs would be to actually go to the sensing auxiliary or co-pilot function of introverted sensing as their growth. But I think the personal development realm is so intuitive pushed, right? It's like, or not pushed, but I would say there's a lot of intuition represented there. There's a lot of intuitive instructors in the personal growth realm. And I would say that there's more and more ENPs. Actually, ENPs have kind of dominated the personal growth realm for a long time, I just realized. Like that just dawned on me, the Tony Robbins and well, actually, I can think of quite a few of them off the top of my head. And so since personal growth and development, particularly of the psychological kind, maybe not so much of the physical body kind, but definitely of the emotional psychological kind, those tend to be a lot of ENPs. And so ESTJs that are into personal growth, again, they're real identified with that function. And when they see it represented in growth heroes, then I think that they identify with that and believe they're ENPs.
I have anecdotally observed something. Anecdotally, I don't have data to back this up. But anecdotally, I've observed also that women, ESTJs or ENTPs, have a tendency to have that lookalike thing going on more than men. I don't know why. It's just an anecdotal observation. And maybe it's just the type of people I tend to hang around women that are those two types more, potentially, and or it might be a pattern. I don't know yet.
I think probably because extroverted thinking is very much welcome in our culture. That particularly for men, that I think that there's not as much complication with their relationship to the function when they know type and when they're getting into it. there's a little bit of sort of reconciliation that women who have extroverted thinking or effectiveness as a dominant or driver have to do in that process. They have to kind of make peace with it and figure it out for themselves. But it explains a lot once they do. So I think that's probably why it trends that direction. So there's a lot of these tertiary lookalike situations. And so I think that that's one big thing to look out for. And, you see it all over the map. INFPs and ISFJs. This is another one that's a lookalike because of that tertiary situation. There's ENFPs and ESFJs. Like ESFJs will think they're ENFPs a lot of times. And so, yeah, it just kind of, it's almost all over the map, but particularly when intuition is the tertiary function. Except in the cases when thinking is the tertiary function. That's another big one. So INFJs believing they're INTPs. That's a big one. Or I would say
ENFPs, right?
ENFPs thinking they're ENTJs. I think that's another big one. So when thinking is a tertiary function, just like intuition, and specifically in the Myers-Briggs community, if a sensor is super into something like this and they have an intuitive tertiary function, they're probably going to identify with it a lot and then think that they are intuitive dominant. But I think in general, a lot of feelers want to believe they're thinkers just in general, particularly if they're a more sensitive type, because very sensitive types will build a coldness into them in order to create distance from other people. I have seen so many INFJs in particular profile themselves as INTPs because they have that real association with introverted thinking as their 10-year-old tertiary. And they just go, oh, this must be me. It's almost like they've identified themselves with their defense strategy. So that's another lookalike. And again, I would actually say from a distance, INFJs and INTPs don't look alike at all from the outside. But because there are INFJs who identify as INTPs and represent themselves that way, and other people don't question as much, then they end up becoming part of the archetype that, as somebody is casually learning the system. And if they run into an INFJ that says they're an INTP, a person will sort of accommodate their, sort of the character in their mind of what an INFJ is to, include they'll refab the INTP character they have in their mind to accommodate the INFJ. And so then they think, well, INTPs can be super sensitive people who blah, 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 blah. And it's like, actually, INTPs are quite sensitive, but in a completely different way than INFJs are. It's a totally different ball of wax. So, and even though they're both using extroverted feeling, but it's a very different beast. So again, it's the over-identification with that 10-year-old or tertiary that creates some of those challenges.
So the takeaway here for you then, if you're in this lookalike type situation, you're like, man, what's going on for me is pay attention to that 10-year-old tertiary in your life and your dominant or driver process. And like we talked about earlier, is this something that you're swimming in? Is this all of your reality around you? It's probably your driver or dominant process. Again, these are just access points. You have to really reflect inside and find this in yourself. Or is this a 10-year-old tertiary situation where you can access it and not access it at will, or come in and out of it and have a relationship with it almost not outside of yourself, but you can get a little perspective on it because it doesn't define everything that your entire reality is around.
Yeah, I think about the ESTJ ENTP thing, which, again, that's something that I've just kind of seen recently. There's a desire to over-diversify when you are extroverted intuition, 10-year-old or tertiary. Like, there's a real desire to that concept we've talked about in previous podcasts, like 7 streams of income is a very ESTJ way of looking at the world. If you don't have 7 streams of income, you're not secure. And that tends to be how ESTJs use extroverted intuition. They're not doing it in the same way that an ENP would be doing it, which is like jumping from thing to thing. ENPs, you're usually sort of fascinated by one thing at a time, but then they jump to the next. But this idea, like as an ENTP, the idea of having to manage 7 different streams of income sounds overwhelming to me. So that makes sense to an ESTJ because they already have the EJ management skills to be able to handle all of that. They've got like the delegating and they've got the system set up. And so 7 streams of income sounds like perfectly manageable. To me as an ENTP, that sounds like a nightmare. How do I manage all of this stuff? So another piece of it is, how are you using it, and does it actually make sense with the type? Like the way it's showing up for you, does that track with somebody of that type? Or in the case that I'm talking about, an ENTP would buckle under that.
We will be right back. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker. Now back to the show. Well, and the other example for ESTJ, men and women having tons of kids. I've seen that anecdotally again. Don't write to be like, I'm an ESTJ, I don't want a bunch of kids, but I've seen it kind of as a pattern, like anecdotally. And with ENTPs, I don't know if that would be a lot to manage, like 7 kids, right? I mean, metaphorically speaking.
I mean, maybe if you're a man, like as a woman, the idea of having 7 kids is, that's an early grave for me. Yeah, that does feel like over-diversification, doesn't it?
Yeah, genetic over-diversification.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that there are also things where we can get tunnel vision, where we're just looking at one aspect that particularly speaks to us, and we attach to that one thing and go, that's me. And then we represent that in communities, or like talk about how we're that thing, and now it gets real confusing, because now I have to accommodate for how you're showing up for how ENTPs are, and sometimes vice versa. As ENTPs sometimes think they're ENTJs, which we'll get to in just a moment. And it's like, well, it's understandable why people would believe they're different types when they have a little bit of confusion around it. And then it just creates confusion in other people, because now they're trying to figure out the system or pattern when those things don't really match up.
Now, just to be clear, when we talk about ESTJ and ENTP, just in case you're new to the system, the driver and 10-year-old tertiary are not interchangeable for those two types. In other words, it's a little different. We're mostly talking about ESTJs that have extroverted intuition as their 10-year-old or tertiary process, identifying as ENTPs. I don't know if the other goes so much the other direction. No. Often they'll be typed that, like when you took a test, Antonia, as an ENTP, you came out as a TJ, like ENTJ, but still, it's not as common that direction. It's more from the ESTJ side to the ENTP side.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, I see that happen sometimes when the driver and the 10-year-old are interchangeable with each other. I've seen ISFPs claim to be INTJs, but I wouldn't necessarily call them lookalikes. I think when an ISFP thinks they're an INTJ, I think it's real obvious from the outside world. I think for ESTJs and ENTPs, there's enough of that energy that the ESTJ brings, enough of that extroverted intuitive energy of like fun and, bouncy. And oftentimes that it can be confusing, particularly since ESTJs are not that well known in the type community to begin with. Like there's a lot of people who think they have major problems with ESTJs because they had some boss or, somebody in their life wasn't that great of a representative. And then that became the prototype for all ESTJs. When really ESTJs are kind of cool, or at least I think they are. I think they're actually rather cool. And I've had lots of friends that were ESTJs. And so there are also these sort of like maligned types in the type community where it's real easy to, if you like that person, think they're not that type because of the, sort of the bias against them. And so there's ESTJs that get away with calling themselves ENTPs for years because people like them. And they're like, well, if you were an ESTJ, I wouldn't like you. And that's not accurate at all. So I think that the bias piece also comes into it. So I think we've explained that tertiary challenge of creating lookalikes pretty well. I think we should also go to just the dichotomy challenge of certain people showing, like attaching to certain dichotomies because it feels like it's better somehow. And the first one that pops out to me is the intuitive sensing dichotomy. Now, we've already talked about sensors that are into things like type already probably having a pretty strong relationship with their intuitive function, and specifically that cognitive function. But I've noticed that when somebody comes in just sort of new to type, there's a lot of confusion around, and I've noticed this with IJs a lot as well, which is weird because IJs would lead with sensing or intuition, but particularly in introverted sensing and introverted intuition. But I've noticed that when a person doesn't know type, they're more likely as an intuitive to think they're a sensor, probably from blending, probably from years of blending. So intuitives will look like sensors out in the wild because they feel like they have to for survival reasons. In the community, or when somebody knows type, that's when a sensor is more likely to look like an intuitive because, again, they're into type. They're into something that has an intuitive bent to begin with, and they're going to identify with that. And so then you get people who are confused about whether or not they're an INFJ or an ISFJ, an INTJ or an ISTJ. And of course, how these people organize the world in the outer world is going to be the same. An ISTJ and an INTJ are both going to use extroverted thinking as their co-pilot or auxiliary. That's going to be what other people see about them. They're going to both really be into systems, and they're going to want to manage their life well. They're going to want concrete, principles or examples. And so it's going to be hard sometimes for an INTJ to not look like an ISTJ, and sometimes vice versa. And then the same thing applies with INFJs and ISFJs. I've also seen this with INFPs and ISFPs, or INTPs and ISTPs. And this is a different issue. This isn't because the auxiliary function is the same, and so that extroverted auxiliary function looks the same to the outside world. It's because their auxiliary co-pilot and 10-year-old tertiary are both intuitive and sensing functions. And so they have a much closer relationship to each other as polarities. And if you're unfamiliar with what polarities are, we've done podcasts on what polarities are, which are two sides of the same coin when it comes to cognitive functions. So an INTP sometimes will think they're a sensor because, again, of that relationship with their tertiary. And as we mentioned before, an ISTP might think they're an INTP because of that relationship with their intuitive tertiary function or 10-year-old function. So you've got the same challenge going on with all the sets of IPs because of the relationship that their co-pilot, auxiliary, and 10-year-old tertiary might have with each other. And then that takes a while to figure out. What's the difference between extroverted intuitive or intuition co-pilot auxiliary versus introverted intuition 10-year-old tertiary? And then those are the kinds of things you have to start flaying out. Am I using introverted intuition, or am I using extroverted intuition? Again, one of my favorite ways to determine this, by the way, is conversation. INPs are much better at showing up in intuitive conversation because that's something that they are thirsting for all the time. And so when an intuitive conversation shows up around them, it kind of doesn't matter the topic. Even if, they might be shy at first because they're not sure how they're going to be received. But if they give themselves permission, they are on that conversation, and they really don't want it to stop. Whereas, as mentioned before, an ISP an ISP that's using introverted intuition as their 10-year-old or tertiary will have a law of diminishing returns on it. And they won't be as forthcoming because, again, they may not have content already post-processed from before to show up to that conversation with, and they'll need to post-process that conversation using their introverted intuition in their 10-year-old or tertiary, which they may or may not do later. That might not be interesting to them later, so they may never post-process that. So intuitive conversation is one of my favorite litmus tests for IPs in particular. I've noticed less of a problem with this with EPs, despite the fact that IJs, who lead with sensing and intuition, have a challenge with it. EPs less so, oftentimes, because their intuitive or sensing function is extroverted, right? They're leading with either extroverted intuition as a dominant or driver, or extroverted sensing as a dominant driver. And that's a little more obvious, both to themselves and to the rest of the world. There's a little less blending that happens with ENPs than INJs because their extroverted intuitive function is it's like something that they can't stamp down. It's like irrepressible. And so that they just get used to being a weirdo. The only time I really see this being a challenge is sometimes ESPs will be into intuitive stuff. Maybe Myers-Briggs, maybe they're really into, crystals or horoscopes or, maybe religious mysticism or something else, something that seems to have like an intuitive bent. And because they're really super into that one thing, they'll feel like they're intuitive as well. But just like with ISPs, it usually doesn't. It's not something that they cross-pollinate, and take in a ton of territory. It's like one thing that they're very into. Oftentimes, they kind of find it fascinating to talk about, but again, they hit a law of diminishing returns if you have a generalized intuitive conversation. And then I think if you hop from sensors and intuitives being lookalikes of each other, and I guess I'm kind of more talking about mistypes here, but an ESP that is like super into crystals will sometimes look like an ENFP, or like an ESFP that's into crystals will look like an ENFP. So those can definitely be lookalikes.
Especially how they express it, right? If there's expression involved in it, like maybe they got a YouTube channel around it or something and they're expressing this, it's like, wow, that must be an intuitive person.
Exactly. So that does create a look-alike scenario, not just a mistype scenario. But moving on from sensors and intuitives being look-alikes of each other, I think another piece is the JP split, the judger or perceiver split. This one is maybe the most confusing because people who share the first three dichotomies but not the last one seem to be the biggest challenge of all in the lookalike arena. I'm talking INFPs and INFJs, ISFPs and ISFJs, INTPs and INTJs, and so on and so forth.
We see a lot of people struggling with this when they come into some of our courses, workshops. They're real close, but they're usually one or the other. And I think I would say that's one of the biggest of all of them that people struggle with personally with themselves. And sometimes not even aware of it. Like I look at the person, I'm like, wow, man, your energy is so this type, and you say you're this type, and I don't know. Like I never want to project that onto somebody or tell them what they are. That's like an ethic we just don't do that here. You have to come up with your own type, but this is the one I see very common.
Yeah. At the end of the day, you get to decide, and also sometimes the eyebrow goes up. It's like, okay, well, all right. You know yourself better than I do. And also there's a bunch of stuff that maybe says it might be over here. But the reason why this one is so difficult, and these are maybe some of the most common lookalikes, and I don't mean mistypes, I mean lookalikes, is because oftentimes the outer behaviors are the same, but the reasons for those behaviors are totally different. And it would almost seem on paper to be ridiculous that these would be lookalikes. INFJs and INFPs, totally different cognitive functions, right? In fact, one could argue that they're shadows of each other in some ways of looking at shadow work. And ENTJs and ENTPs, totally different. ESFJs and ESFPs, totally different cognitive functions. And yet people will get this wrong so often. And it's because the energy of the person in the outer world, what they are projecting outward, is frequently identical. You can have an ESFJ and an ESFP both doing the same behaviors of keeping morale up in a room, of making everybody feel happy, of telling jokes and being like the life of the party. And you look at these two people and you're like, I have no idea which one is which. I'd argue this is probably one of the biggest challenges that our students that go through profiler training face, is that oftentimes, we'll do a profiling session and the person's like, I thought they were a perceiver and not a judger, or vice versa. And a lot of mistypes happen around this. In fact, this is maybe one of the most common mistypes. So what do you do, right? You can't even look at functions, right? Because it's like they're totally different. So how can you figure out, or at least you can't point to any specific attachment to a function as the challenge, because there is no similar function to attach to. So how can you even know?
Yeah, it's in a person that is feeling like they're a different type than maybe they are, is looking at the markers, the energy and the behaviors of someone, and they're going, okay, I'm like that person. I must be that type. And they're not really asking themselves, well, why do I behave the way I do? Why do I have the energy attunement? They're not getting into the wiring of it, the underpinning of the motivations, the reasons, all these things that create the emergent. They're looking at the emergent itself and just matching emergence up and saying, well, I behave this way. I have the same energy. I must be like this type.
Well, and yeah, it's like the simplest answer is probably the right one. And yet we can use our function stack to, our car model to justify almost anything. I think about somebody who eventually discovered her best fit type as ENFJ. And, she's this great person who is incredibly intelligent and very well studied and super into, systems. And at first she thought she was an introvert, like an INFP, like an introvert and a perceiver. And over time, she realized, no, I'm actually an extrovert. And then she thought she was an ENFP. But every time we would talk about things like perceivers being sloppy, she'd always go, no, I'm not sloppy. And she'd be the exception to the rule. She'd be like, no. And so the explanation then was that her extroverted thinking 10-year-old or tertiary was the part of her that was really organized and really, decided that she needed to have a very organized closet and it was all color coded and all sorts of stuff. Eventually, she realized through relationships and conversations that she's an ENFJ. And then the color coded organized closet suddenly became super obvious, right? And it was like, well, it could be explained away as an ENFP by extroverted thinking 10-year-old or tertiary. It could be. But the simplest solution is actually that she was a judger. That's the simplest solution. And so I think sometimes we use function stacks or the car model to sort of explain away behaviors that are oddities for us, when really we might just need to look at what is a more simple answer. It does happen that way. Confusing and complex, different function meeting each other and like your Enneagram type and how you're raised and your culture and all that stuff coming in will sometimes be the system that creates this weird ass emergent at the end. That does happen. And usually it's the simplest answer. Usually if you're a super organized person and absolutely require a lot of organization, you're probably an EJ. If you're a person who's super sloppy and can't get your stuff together, you're probably an EP or an IP. like it's just, it does happen. And also it oftentimes is the simpler answer. So I think when it comes to this judger perceiver piece, I think being real honest about not just what you're doing, but why you're doing it, whether or not the attachment you have to a certain type is based on, even lookalike types is based on a little bit of mental gymnastics. But I think the real key to this operation actually does live in the functions. And that is, what's your relationship to your inferior function? Like how does that look? The person who I'm thinking of right now, who was the ENFJ, who eventually came to discover her best fit type was the ENFJ, is a person who very much has chosen a subject and has gone super deep with it and knows everything there is to know about this one subject, right? And it's just mastered it and is very forthcoming with the subject, really wants to help everybody else out with understanding it and is kind of a natural teacher. That's more evidence of introverted thinking as an inferior function than it is introverted sensing as an inferior function. Not that ENFPs can't be, very studied on a single subject, but just the nature of being an ENFP means that you more want to be, you more want to have a whole bunch of different subjects, be more of a jack of all trades and bring them together and sort of squish them all together and see how they all meet in the middle, than to have a single subject that you've really mastered. That's more of an introverted thinking 3-year-old or inferior function. So and a lot of self-criticism, right? Challenges with self-criticism and that sort of thing. So it's what your relationship to the 3-year-old function or inferior function is will give you a lot of insight into what's actually going on for you cognitively, particularly if you're between two lookalike types and your behaviors aren't really giving you any clues, right? It's not really telling you what's going on. And you can't really figure out what your auxiliary function is, because sometimes, take, for example, for INTJs and INTPs, the combination of introverted intuition and extroverted thinking can look very similar to the combination of introverted thinking and extroverted intuition. Enough so that until you do a real deep dive and really understand how they're showing up for you, I mean, you could have a career that has made them almost look identical for you, right? Like you've got an INTJ and an INTP both in software programming. They both do an excellent job. They're both outputting like crazy. They're both, I don't know, right, like writing beautiful code and solving problems. And the INTJ is slightly less satisfied than the INTP. But you wouldn't know that because they're like, I'm making good money, so it's going to be fine. So it's satisfying their extroverted thinking. So even though they're not as happy coding as the INTP, they're happy making good money. And so you would never know that, right? And they're not going to really know that about themselves necessarily either. But that relationship with extroverted sensing is a totally different ball of wax than the relationship an INTP is going to have with extroverted feeling as the 3-year-old or inferior. So sometimes it's the best place to go, being real radically honest with yourself to be able to flay out these two lookalike types.
One of the most profound experiences for us, Antonia, you and me, is during our profiler training live events, we have 2 full days where we do what's called embodiment exercises. And we take all eight cognitive functions, and we have discussion and activities, specific activities designed as a group to get us into the energy field or the expression of that cognitive function. And we split up into small groups, and we have exercises that do this. And it's so interesting to watch people, especially people that come with a lookalike type, like they may be going between 2 types that look alike and they're really having a struggle. When they get into that cognitive function space of the other type that they're not, eventually they come to a type and they're like, man, I really believe I'm this type now after this experience. It's so interesting to watch people attempt to access those other functions using the function in their type. And it becomes very clear, very quick to most people, I'd say 99% of people that go through this experience, very, very quickly becomes apparent to them, oh my goodness, I see the energy of this expression of this cognitive function. I see how I'm attempting, for example, to get into introverted intuition, but maybe they're an ISFJ and they're using introverted sensing to try to do it. And it becomes very clear to them like, oh, I see what I'm even when I'm trying to get into this other function, I see what I'm approximating it with what I've got inside myself. And that can be a real eye-opener for someone to attempt to embody another function that's not theirs, or embody their function and see how much ease there is. I talk about an ISFJ example when all the rest of us, the bunch of intuitives in the room are trying to get into introverted sensing and we're clumsily stumbling through it, and the ISFJ in the room just goes there immediately, brilliantly. It becomes very clear to the ISFJ, like, oh, okay, I'm right here. Like, it didn't even take me any effort. I just live in this place. So it's such an interesting experience during that I think once you energetically start to tap into what these functions do and how they behave, you get a lot of clarity around that. So as we work toward more things at Personality Hacker, I think we're going to be thinking in terms of how can we help people access those energies. I know that sounds a little woo-woo, but they're energies around these functions. How can we help you access those to play with them to get a sense of what you're showing up with or what you're not showing up with?
I don't think you have to call it woo-woo.
I know. We've gotten feedback about this. Stop saying woo-woo. Stop making apology for it.
Yeah.
But I am married to an NT, and I know there's a lot of NTs in our audience who, and not that NTs are against the quote-unquote woo-woo, but sometimes, I don't know. I probably as a feeler, intuitive feeler, I'm just like, oh, I got to make apology for that or something. Who knows?
Yeah, you don't. I'm an NT, but I'm super into the woo. And unapologetically so at this point.
Sure.
And all the other NTs are going to be fine. They'll live with it.
I know. I'm trying to train myself. I'm really trying to train myself. It just comes out sometimes.
Yeah. It's the sensor thinkers that are like, maybe. But they're going to be fine too. If they're into us, they're used to the woo.
We'll just drag them across the finish line.
That's right. You're coming with us.
So what do you think? You've been here with us for this conversation. We're giving you some principle, high-level ideas and access points to be thinking about this in your own life. Do you struggle between 2 types or more? Have you discovered your own type through an exploratory process? And what was that like for you? We want to hear from you. You've been part of the conversation without a microphone, but now it's your turn to come and make your voice heard. Come over to personalityhacker.com. Leave a comment, ask a question, or more importantly, share your story. We want you to make your voice heard on the website.
If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes. and various Android platforms. If you leave a rating and review on iTunes, that helps us out a lot. We have a book. It's called Personality Hacker. It's available at all major book retailers. If you leave us a rating and review on Amazon or Goodreads, that also helps us out a lot. And of course, we're able to do this podcast for almost completing 7 years now.
Wow.
I know. I'm not even 100% sure how that happened. I know. Every once in a while, I just pat myself on the back for being an ENP that's done something for this long.
For 7 years.
That wasn't required to be done, like child rearing. Anyway, so we've been doing it for a long time, and one of the ways that we've been able to do that is because we have a suite of programs available at personalityhacker.com under the catalog that are personal growth oriented and are tailored for your type. So go check those out if that is interesting to you.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker.